Hello, my name is Michael Tillotson, and I am an author. And when I say author, I'm referring to someone who's been published. This is as opposed to writer, which is just someone who writes. All authors are writers, but not all writers are authors. These are my books right here. They are quite swell. I point out this distinction because there's more to publishing a book than just writing. There are a lot of other steps in the process, and aside from just writing, the next biggest one is probably editing, which is what we're going to be talking about today. So, broadly speaking, there are two different kinds of editing. The one you'll be doing most of the time when going through the publishing process is group editing or peer editing, whatever you want to call it. This is going to take up the bulk of your editing time, and in my opinion, it's the easier of the two. This is basically just editing where someone else is involved. You send your book out to them, they send it back with a ton of comments and suggestions and that sort of thing, and then you edit based on that. I went through this style of editing 3 times with The Heart of the World and twice with The Witch of the Starlight Coven. However, we're going to be talking about the other kind of editing, which is solo editing. As you can probably gather, this is editing where those other parties are not involved. You're just editing by yourself. This is generally done near the beginning and near the end of the publishing process. With you editing by yourself, though, there's a lot more room for how you'll go about things than with peer editing. With peer editing, you have to wait until your book is in a position that you're comfortable sending it out to another person, and then you need to wait on that person to send it back to you. But if you're editing by yourself, then how you go about it is just up to you. But this begs the question, when should I start editing? Like a lot of things when it comes to writing, there's not an objectively right answer. The editing process that works for one person may not work for another. But let me share with you how I do it and why. The 2 main ways you can do solo editing is either you wait until your book is finished, or you edit as you go along. Some people have good methods for editing as you go along, I'm sure, but I personally would not recommend it for a few reasons. The first is pretty simple. It's a higher time investment. For a project that's not actually finished yet, you're putting in extra time to refine what you've put down, but if for whatever reason you don't finish your book, that time's just flushed down the drain, and there's nothing you can really do about that. Both of my books are designed to be trilogies, but I wrote them both in a way where, even if the second book doesn't ever get published, they have good enough endings on their own. And so far this has been a good plan, because after I finished both books, I sat down to write the sequels, and got so far in each of them, but then I stopped. The first draft, or the second Heart of the World, is already halfway done. But it's been halfway done for probably almost a year. If I had been putting in extra time to edit as I go while writing the second Heart of the World, chances are I still would have hit this block halfway through, and all of that time I spent editing simply might not pay off. In addition to that, my grandpa is also a writer. I'm not really going to recommend any of his books here. I tried giving one a read, but his style isn't really my thing, and I never finished. So I can't really speak for them, but I have heard him talking about his writing process every now and then. And he's mentioned on a few occasions that he runs into this trap where he just keeps rewriting the first chapter over and over and over again. This is kind of a risk to editing as you go. If you're obsessed with getting everything right in the first draft, you may wind up writing a scene or a chapter that you're not happy with over and over and over again. And as you can imagine, this can stifle your progress. And then that, in turn, loops back to the first issue of not ever finishing the book and just losing all that extra time you spent editing. I would also not recommend editing as you go, because of something I call recency bias. I don't know if that's its official name, but the idea is the more recently we've experienced something, the more we look at it in a positive light. You're probably familiar with Avatar: The Last Airbender and its sequel series, The Legend of Korra. Personally, I think both series are really good, but which one I like better usually just boils down to whichever one I watched last. And no doubt this will also apply as you write. If you write down a scene one day and edit it the next day, you're probably going to have this recency bias swirling around in your head. And as a result of this, you're not really going to notice whatever flaws the scene may have. By contrast, if you give yourself time and you come back later, you'll be looking at it with a pair of fresh eyes, and that might help you see if the scene really works the way you intended. Another reason to not edit as you go is your understanding of the world and its rules is most likely going to deepen as the story goes on. This will depend to some extent how much prep work you put in beforehand, but when I was working on The Heart of the World, my understanding of the Heart of the world deepened from my first draft to my second, a lot more when it did than when I went from the first draft of The Witch of the Starlit Coven to its second draft. And the main reason for this is the work I put in beforehand with The Witch of the Starlit Coven. If you've read Heart of the World, you should be familiar with HC magic, for instance. Early on when writing Heart of the World for the first time, Bop knew this magic. Later on, when I had actually finished the book, this didn't make any sense from a lore perspective. But if I had just continued editing as I went along, all that editing would be made with the idea that Bob knew HC, though by the time I got to the second draft, I knew he didn't. Now, bear in mind, everything I've just said is just the broad strokes. Both The Heart of the World and Witch of the Starlit Coven, there were scenes that I went back and edited the next day after writing them down. This is usually what happened when I wrote the scene during my daily writing time, and later I had a better idea for how that scene could play out, so I went and rewrote it. But I made sure this wasn't a frequent thing, and furthermore, this only applied to big edits. Like if I was taking the story in an entire different direction than the original scene implied. For minor edits, not so much. If I was just changing a line of dialogue or removing a flying horse from the prologue, I would just leave myself a note, and I'd worry about the actual writing later. The way I would recommend looking at it is the first draft is for getting things done, not doing them well. You'll have plenty of time to clean things up later. Though, don't take that to mean you should just purposefully sacrifice quality. Always try your best when writing, just don't obsess about something not being up to par in the first draft. But okay, so you finish your first draft. How should you go about editing it from here? I would recommend giving the book some space. Take a break. I still write something else during this time, but basically you just want to avoid that recency bias. And the longer you wait, the more fresh your eyes are going to be when you come back. It's kind of a balancing game, how long you want to wait. Your edits will probably be of higher quality the longer you wait, but you also don't want to put it off for too long, and I imagine that probably has diminishing returns too. With The Heart of the World, I waited for a month after finishing the first draft to the second draft, and for any subsequent draft I waited 2 weeks. For Witch of the Starlit Coven, I jumped straight into the 2-week break rather than waiting the whole month. When you go to make these edits, make sure to keep all your old drafts, because sometimes, especially in the cases of really big edits, like cutting out a whole chapter, you can get a little lost, and it's a little nice to have your old version to refer to when this happens. In The Heart of the World, there were 2 entire chapters that got cut and replaced, and can you imagine how horrible it would have been if, for some reason, I failed on writing one of those new chapters, but had also scrapped my old ones? I would have just been out of luck. And that aside, it's also just kind of fun to go back to the old versions every now and then and see the stuff that you cut and may have forgotten about since. But that's all from me. Hopefully this isn't helpful, and I'll see you in another video.